Is racism permanent? Is it something that is going to last forever? Is it something that is in some way embedded either in human nature or in Western culture or in, well, the genetic makeup of white people? These are all questions raised by critical race theory, which supplies dogmatic answers to these questions, but without any kind of supporting examination or investigation. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to turn the assumption of critical race theory, the permanence of racism, into a question. We know that the CRT guys believe racism to be permanent, in part because if you take one of the gurus of CRT, this is Derek Bell, the Harvard legal scholar, and his kind of pioneering work, which is called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. What's the subtitle of that book? The Permanence of Racism. And there you go. And all the sort of nostrums of critical race theory that you can't really atone for racism. Exactly why? Because it's permanent. It's not going away. So there's nothing to atone for. And that this is a kind of incurable ill, which calls for perpetual villainization of whites and perpetual victimization of minorities, particularly blacks. All of this, I think, needs to be scrutinized and needs to be scrutinized with some level of intellectual probing and depth. That's what I hope to do in this special episode. So let me begin by looking at where racism comes from. Well, one idea worth considering is that racism is universal. It's part of human nature. It exists all over the world. It's always existed. There's some form of racism everywhere. And that's the universality possibility. Here's a second possibility. Racism arises out of slavery. So the notion here is that racism isn't necessarily universal. People don't automatically come up with the idea of dividing people by race or establishing racial superiority or inferiority. That racism is a kind of handmaiden of slavery. And when you have slavery, it creates in the masters a desire to say, we're on top and you're at the bottom. We're better than you are. And so racism becomes a necessary kind of adjunct to slavery as a form of exploitation and oppression. A third possibility, racism is a kind of feature, pathology of Western and of white culture. And the people who argue this will make observations like, hey, have you noticed that in the English language, terms associated with black are generally negative? Think of things like blackmail or blackball or black mass, blacklist, black magic, black market, black sheep. All of that suggests something wicked or disgraceful, corrupt, negative. But white is generally associated with purity and beauty. And one of the left-wing writers, Paula Rothenberg, argues that, look, even if you take the concept of a white lie, which is negative, but a white lie means kind of a small lie, a trivial lie. So the whitening of a lie is kind of the minimization of the lie. So all of this is a way of attributing racism here to not only the culture, but the very language of Western culture. Now, I'm going to look at all this in some depth, but I want to give you in advance my conclusion. I want to give you the argument I'm going to be making over the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to argue that racism is not universal. It's not part of the human condition. In fact, racism hasn't always even existed in the West. If you look at the ancient world, you won't find, I will argue, a single example of racism anywhere in the West or in the world prior to the modern era. I'm going to argue that racism in that sense is modern. It developed in the West for reasons that I'll talk about. I'm going to show that racism is not part of the English language, and terms like black male and black sheep have nothing to do with racism. I'm going to insist that racism did have an historical beginning. It's a modern and a Western ideology. You can find hints of it in other cultures, but it developed not because of slavery. In fact, it developed in the West prior to slavery. Now, it was, of course, reinforced by slavery, which is to say that slavery made racism stronger by giving racism made racism a sort of rationalization for slavery. But racism wasn't caused by slavery. In fact, racism was really caused when the white man, in the modern era, for the first time, began to encounter what the white man himself called primitive culture. In other words, cultures that were seen as dramatically backward compared to the state of Western culture at the time. And by at the time here, we mean between about the 17th and the 19th centuries. So the modern era. And what does racism do? It provides a kind of explanation, a kind of coherent account, if you will, of huge civilizational differences between Western culture on the one hand and so-called primitive cultures on the other, differences that, at least according to the Europeans, could not be accounted for by environmental or cultural differences and were therefore attributed to nature itself, to natural differences. Now, before we dive into all this, I want to begin by just talking about what racism is. What is it? What's the definition of racism? Well, racism is an ideology of intellectual or moral superiority based upon the biological characteristic of race. Now, there's a lot in there, and we need to tease out the features of that definition. First of all, to believe to be a racist, you must first believe that human beings can be biologically distinguished on the basis of race. If you don't believe that you can do that, then racism becomes kind of meaningless because you can't tell the difference. You have to be able to observe and notice some inherent differences among people. Number two, you have to rank those differences. If you notice a bunch of differences, but they don't mean anything to you, there's no racism. You have to rank them in terms of superiority and inferiority. And third, you have to hold those rankings to be biological or innate. If you don't hold them to be biological, if you think that they're cultural and mutable and changeable, then you don't have racism at all. So with that definition of racism, let's now probe the question, did racism have a beginning?